So, a friend of mine works with a large company, and in his yearly goal setting interview, his manager asked him this question: what can you, as a staff member, do in order to contribute to a positive organizational culture here in this company? He was not very sure how to best answer this question, so he asked me. How would you answer this question, he asked. I said, well, if I were you, I would ask the manager to clarify what he means by a positive organizational culture. What is positive in his mind? Well, let's take a look at this question in this video. Let's also take a look at a few additional questions about organizational culture. What is organizational culture? What kinds of organizational cultures are there? Is an organization's culture uniform? Strong versus weak culture, which one is better? What does organizational culture do? And we'll talk about how to create, manage, and potentially change an organization's culture. So first, definition. Many have tried to define organizational culture, but the definition that I like the best is this. Organizational culture refers to this system of shared meaning held by members that distinguishes one organization from another. It is the sum of how people do things in an organization. It incorporates and encompasses behaviors, norms, and values of members of an organization. It is essentially the way we do things around here. Second question, typology. What kinds of organizational cultures are there? There are various models describing and categorizing organizational cultures, and these different models use different criteria in order to categorize organizational cultures into categories or types. Let's take a look at a few examples. Categorizing organizational cultures on the basis of level of formalization and decision-making being centralized or decentralized. Harrison's typology of organizational culture incorporates task orientation, role orientation, power orientation, and person or support orientation. Dio and Kennedy categorize organizational culture on the basis of speed of feedback and level of risk. Their typology includes tough guy culture, work hard, play hard culture, process culture, and bet your company culture. Cameron and Queen recognize adhocracy culture, clan culture, hierarchy culture, and market culture using the criteria of flexibility versus stability and internal focus versus external focus. When we combine the various criteria used in various typologies and models, we end up with a broad picture. So instead of putting organizational cultures into just 4 boxes, empirical research tends to measure 7 things when it comes to organizational culture. And these 7 factors or dimensions or characters that best capture an organization's culture are the following: innovation and risk-taking, attention to detail, outcome orientation, people orientation, team orientation, aggressiveness, and stability. Innovation and risk-taking refers to the degree to which members of an organization are innovative and take risks in the conduct of their work. Attention to detail is the level at which members of the organization show precision, accuracy, and analysis in their work. Outcome orientation refers to the degree to which management cares about results and outcomes instead of processes or techniques to achieve them. People orientation is the degree to which decision-making takes into account the effects of managerial decisions on people instead of only on production. Team orientation is the degree to which work activities are organized around teams rather than individual employees. Aggressiveness is the level at which members of the organization are aggressive and competitive. And stability refers to the degree to which members of the organization emphasize status quo instead of change. This 7-factor structure was derived from empirical research, and all 7 factors exist on a continuum between low to high, and together they paint a composite picture of an organization's culture. Next question: is an organization's culture uniform? The answer is not necessarily. Regardless of which organizational culture typology one would choose to use in order to measure an organization's culture, it is likely, particularly in large organizations, that different subcultures would exist inside one organization. Most likely, subcultures would develop among different departments or sections of the organization. As such, an organization's overall culture as an independent variable would be less predictive of this organization's members' behaviors. Instead, the more proximal subcultures would be more predictive or reflective of the people's behaviors inside those departments. So, if you are working in a large organization, chances are that the organizational culture that your department has can be quite different from another department. Alright, so now moving on to the next question: a strong versus a weak culture. Which one is better? Well, the general view these days is that a strong organizational culture, one in which a company's core values are intensely held and shared by members, is relatively more beneficial towards both the employees and the organization. Research shows that in companies where there is a strong organizational culture, employee turnover tends to be low, satisfaction, commitment, loyalty, and cohesiveness tend to be high. Although it is important to mention that these are mostly correlational findings. In other words, we cannot be 100% sure that high employee satisfaction and commitment are necessarily the result of a strong culture. It is also possible that because employees are committed, satisfied, and cohesive, that is why the organization is able to have and maintain a strong culture. And it is also possible that the direction of causality is actually bidirectional. Next question, what does organizational culture do? Both the positive and the negative. The positive effect of organizational culture, as I have indicated to a certain extent, is mainly that a strong organizational culture can give employees a sense of meaning and identity, give them a sense of being part of something greater than themselves. Research also suggests that organizational culture contributes to stability, satisfaction, loyalty, and commitment. But a strong organizational culture can also be a liability. The main downside of a strong culture is that it functions as a barrier to change. It inhibits diversity or diverse viewpoints, and it could also pose a challenge for mergers and acquisitions. This is because once an organization's members subscribe to a certain culture, a certain set of norms and values, they will most likely to want to hold on to them, because after all, culture exists to sustain itself. All right, next question. How to create, manage, and change an organization's culture. Let's start by talking about how an organization culture begins. Most commonly, an organization's culture begins with its founders or sometimes with the first cohort of managerial staff, because it is typically these people who would set the initial norms for a company. They would also likely hire people who they believe share their views, values, and beliefs. As such, these founding members of an organization would consciously or subconsciously establish a company's initial culture. How is this culture sustained through time? Well, provided that the management team does not change, they will likely continue to select and hire people that they think fit with the organization's culture. And the induction, socialization, orientation, and training programs will continue to indoctrinate new employees with the organizational culture of the company. The existing culture of the company is communicated, sustained, and even further reinforced through the behavioral norms of the company, the language and jargons people use inside the organization, and the different organizational symbols and rituals like team days or Monday morning coffee briefings or things like that. If indeed culture exists to sustain itself, how do we change it? There are various change management models, and I'll talk about the Cotter's model of organizational change. When we're talking about changing an organization's culture, we must first have a clear understanding of what the current culture is. One would need to measure the existing organizational culture. Remember those 7 dimensions I talked about earlier? Are organizational members competitive? To what extent do they value status quo versus change and innovation? Are they process-oriented? So on and so forth. We also need to know whether there is a uniform culture within the company or whether there are various subcultures coexisting. Also, do we have a strong or a weak culture? To what extent are the norms and values shared by all members of the organization? After we have a clear and accurate assessment of the current organizational culture, the management needs to strategically think about what aspects of the current culture need to be changed. Do we want to promote innovation? Do we want to decrease outcome orientation? What do we want to have changed? The leadership of the company must have a clear direction of where we want to go. And then steps can be taken to initiate the change. Organizational members need to understand and be convinced why this change is necessary. A coalition of key organizational members need to be formed in order to implement the change. The current status quo needs to be unfrozen, new practices and policies need to be put into place and acted upon, and the new changes must be consolidated and enforced in order to create a new, stable pattern of behaviors. And as such, an organization's culture can be adjusted, tweaked, or even changed. Finally, let's get to my friend's question. How can he, as an employee, contribute to a positive organizational culture at the company where he works? Is there such a thing as a positive organizational culture? In the organizational behavior literature, there actually is such a concept known as positive culture. It is the emphasis and the promotion of a set of values to be pursued in organizations. And this concept is centered around three key aspects: building on employee strength, rewarding more than punishing, and vitality and growth. For the first element, building on employee strength, this means that the management ought to recognize and utilize the natural talents of their employees, show the employees how they themselves can capitalize on their strength and natural talents, and make use or take advantage of these talents on an organizational level. The second element, rewarding more than punishing. Focus on providing both intrinsic and extrinsic rewards to employees when they do things right. Catching employees doing something right and promptly rewarding them is a big part of creating a positive organizational culture. These rewards do not always have to be costly and substantial. Something as easy and small as a genuine praise can go a long way. The third and last element, emphasizing vitality and growth. So give the employee not a job, but a career. Research shows time again that employees value promotion and growth opportunities. Don't make them feel that they are just a cog or a screw in a big machine. Show them that they can grow. When the management does these three things consistently, they could contribute to a more positive organizational culture. Let me end this video by saying that there are limits to what organizational cultures can do. Even the strongest, most positive organizational culture would not necessarily guarantee organizational success, effectiveness, and performance. The arbitrary and mechanical pursuit of a strong and positive organizational culture can even be coercive and Orwellian. So, let's not overdo it. Alright, thanks for watching this Ranywayz random video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.